So I was. So let me tell you about one of my own experiences of having to confront my own imaginative gridlock. So I was asked to come to Fuller Seminary as Mark Labradon's first vice presidential appointee because we were basically working on the issue that theological education has been in a crisis for the better part of a decade. There are 10,000 less students today in seminaries than there were a decade ago, and 1,000 less of those are at Fuller. There's 1,000 less at a place like Fuller. This has always been a big school. Actually, we're now down to we used to be at 4,300 and we're now under 3,000, right? So it's a big school. It's still 10 times bigger than most seminaries, but it's still, you do your math. It affects you in different ways, right? So we were in the middle of that. And the first challenge that we took on was the fact that many of our students said, I came out of Fuller smarter, like I had better theology, but I came out of it less faithful. My faith got deconstructed. I needed more formation. Some of you are like, yeah, I was a student there. That's exactly right, right? So my job was to be with a person who tried to put formation back into our curriculum. That was its own challenge, but we worked on that. And then after doing that for 3 years, they asked me to work on a different challenge, which is more and more denominations don't require theological education. You don't have to have an MDiv to get ordained. What people have said is we want theological education and we want spiritual formation, but we don't want to we don't need initials and we don't need debt. We don't need degrees and debt. So if you can find a way to deliver that to us where we don't have to take on a bunch of debt or worry about getting initials after our names, that would be great. So I helped start this new thing called the Fuller Leadership Platform that is now called Fuller Equip, which is a way how we could deliver resources to people in real time. So, and you don't have to be a student. You can just get them. You can sign up and get them. So we started working on that project, and as I came up with the idea for it, I said this to the trustees, and one of the trustees said, hey, so I'm a lawyer in Silicon Valley, and one of the things you need to know is any innovative idea in a traditional institution usually doesn't make it. like those ideas don't happen. They don't. You probably know the whole story that, Xerox had the laser graphic user interface that Apple used long before Apple had it. They had it and didn't use it. Kodak had digital cameras. They had the whole digital thing, but they were committed to film, and so that worked out well for them, right? This is what we do. If you know the Saturn car, General Motors created the Saturn. It sold like crazy. People really liked it. It was great, and then they killed it because General Motors didn't like what it was doing, so they got rid of it. So he goes, you're going to be the next Saturn of Fuller. How do you like that? And so I said, oh my gosh, what do I do? And he said, what if you met with a group of Silicon Valley folks who are experts in innovation? So I flew up to San Jose, got off the plane, went into Palo Alto on one of those famous streets and I was in a room, all Christians. They were venture capitalists, and they were consultants, and they were entrepreneurs, and they were executives for some of those famous companies that are in the news today. And they were sitting there around the table, and they said, here's what we want you to do. Give us your pitch. Pitch to us the idea that you have, like you want us to fund it. That's what we're used to. People come to us with an idea, we decide if it's a good idea, we give them money. You need to know we're not giving you any money. We're just going to give you our advice. But give us your pitch. So I did. I gave them the pitch. And they said, okay, so who are you trying to help? I said, we want to help church leaders who don't necessarily need our degrees or our debt, but they want to keep growing as leaders, and they want their people to keep growing as leaders. That's who we want to help. He said, great. Did my 10-minute pitch. I looked around the room feeling pretty good about myself, and they were all laughing. They were all smirking, and they're kind of shaking their heads. And I'm like, what did I do? Maybe the technology wasn't working, right? And I looked up, and one of the guys goes, you've been doing that around Fuller a lot, haven't you? I said, oh yeah, that's why I'm here. I did it for the trustees. I've had to do it for the faculty to convince them. I have convinced staff to leave their, secure jobs to come work with me in a division where I got to raise every dime of the thing. Yeah, I've had to just convince this. He said, because what you just did is gave us a 10-minute presentation on why this was so important, because it would help Fuller survive. It'll help theological education survive. Todd, nobody cares if your institution survives. They only care if your institution cares about them. So get out and talk to people about what they care about, and stop telling them about what you care about. Nobody cares if your institution survives. I mean, let's just be candid. Nobody cares if your church survives. Half of your towns, they would love you to go under, man. They can then bulldoze your church and put in a Costco. They'll get tax revenue. It's awesome. cool, funky buildings all over the country. They make really great brew pubs. Like, it's really great. Nobody cares if churches survive anymore. They care if you care about them. And so the challenge has to stop being about our changing for us. The challenge is for us to become something that is relevant to anybody else, that we demonstrate that what we're about is about them. He said, so you should get out and talk to people and find out what they actually need and care about and build that. Because the default behavior for most organizational leaders is to solve problems for our organizations, rather than change our organizations for the needs of the world. Think about this. How many of us are sitting here right now going, how do we get back our people? If you're like any of the churches that I work with around the country, your attendance is probably somewhere between 30 to 60% of what it was before COVID. It probably fluctuates. It goes up and down. You're trying to figure it out, and you're trying to figure out, how do I get those people back? And one of the things you're trying to don't even recognize is most of the people may never come back. What does it mean that we spend all of our time trying to figure out how to fill our pews and very little of our time asking ourselves a question about the pain of the world that the church could be addressing? That flip alone for most of us is being retraining. It's rethinking the way we think about the nature and purpose of a church. Now, one of the problems for most of us is that we've spent most of our time being trained to give leadership to organizations and institutions that want to be self-perpetuating. In the Presbyterian Church, we'll talk about it this way. We need a Presbyterian presence in that town. It doesn't matter that there's 14 other churches all on the same street in some places, but they're not a Presbyterian presence. Oh, and how about this? Maybe they're not our particular Presbyterian presence. I mean, there's another Presbyterian, as if anybody in the world cares. They can't even spell Presbyterian, care about which initials of Presbyterians are on the door. And yet we find ourselves overwhelmingly trying to bring change for the sake of our institution. One of the giant shifts that has to happen is to begin to start asking more and more about the world at this moment. So whenever we work with churches, we basically put two questions before them all the time. These are the two, what we call our Keystone adaptive questions. These are the questions to think about. These questions, whether if you're in one of our cohorts, we've got 18 churches going through a cohort that meets in a summits every once a quarter, and then does stuff online. We've got another 12 churches that are all going through a process of doing 100% online. We got $1 million from Lilly to be able to study how we can actually help train churches better. We've got individual congregations that pay us to consult and work with just their churches. We got every scale, and we're studying it all. And the question we give all of them are these two questions. How might the charism of our congregation address the pain points of our community as an expression of God's mission in the world? How might the charism of our congregation address the pain points of our community? Notice those terms. Charism is the first one. I love this term. It's a Catholic term. Okay, so I was raised Roman Catholic, and so I don't have any negative Catholic baggage. I always say I can't be in the Catholic Church any more than I can live at my mother's house. The Catholic Church is kind of like my mother's house, but I don't need you making fun of the wallpaper. It's still my mother's house, But what Catholics had is this amazing ability to think about how do you affirm different missional purposes in a larger umbrella. So think about the orders. I don't know if you've ever been to St. Andrew's Priory out in Lancaster. It's a Benedictine monastery. Or if you hang out with them, you'll know their charism is faith and work. It's about prayer and work. They integrate prayer and work. That's what they teach people to do. So if you go hang out with them, they will invite you into their prayer life. Here's when we pray. You're welcome. Don't matter if you're Catholic. Don't have to join our order. Our gift to you is we give you prayer. And if you hang out more in a couple days, they're going to ask you to do the dishes. Because prayer and work go together. Benedictines, that's their charism. If you're a Jesuit, their charism is being the missionaries who will go anywhere in the world for the glory of God. So Benedictines started monasteries, Jesuits started Georgetown. There's no monasteries for Jesuits because they instead have a set of spiritual practices that held people together who might not ever see each other. Like imagine being a missionary sent out by your order to go to a place and you will never see your sisters and brothers ever again. and that's the normal way of being. What holds you together? It's a set of spiritual practices. Different orders have different charisms. Different charisms lead to different practices. So the question that we ask churches to think all the time is this: what is your charism? What's your gift? What is it that you offer to the community? What's the thing about you that is the thing that God has blessed you with and put in your midst that is so uniquely about you that if you stopped doing it, you would have no reason to be? And do you know yourself well enough to know what that is? And not what you should be. People always tell me what we should be, but actually what you are. And how would that charism address the genuine pain points of your community? And how do you know that those people are in pain? And then once you're clear on how your charism addresses the pain point of your community, then you ask the question, how might that inspire us to faithfully change or grow? Our change isn't to become something we're not. It's not for the Presbyterian church to say, oh, you know what we need to do is we need to be called the flood. And if we're called the flood, then we'll be cool and people will come. No, that ain't it. It's to become the best version of yourself. And it's to acknowledge that what you have to give because of the pain of the world will require you to change. Fuller Seminary didn't stop doing degrees. We still continue to believe in our scholarship. I literally spend my whole life at Fuller is about doing scholarship around adaptive leadership and formation of leaders so that we can figure out how that addresses the pain point of the church. It's to be your best version of yourself. So when we work with churches, we give them this little diagram. This diagram is what people are like now having. If you're in our groups, you end up having this on your eyeballs, right? How does our charism address the pain points of the community? And how might that require us to change with the transformation that's needed? And what you realize is that red line, which is resistance and sabotage, well, those are all the underlying issues that we have to address if we're going to move forward. That's the challenge that we have. And the leadership needed is to answer that question. How might our church, our charism, the gift that we are, address the pain points of our community that we are called into? And how might that require us to change and grow and adapt faithfully? Adaptive leadership is about transformation. It's about the transformation of your own people so they can address the challenges that's in front of them. I define it this way. Leadership is about energizing your people toward their own transformation so they can accomplish God's mission in the world. It's always transformation and change together. So for us, it requires the capacity for ongoing transformation through ongoing building of trust. Trust is the first part of transformation. So here's one of the things we teach people. Trust is not transformation. But there is no transformation without trust. Trust is like the grain in the silos. You need a lot of it if you're going to put it in the ground to be able to feed the world. Trust is like the money needed to build a building. You need a lot of resources if you're going to build the building, but the money is not the building. You can't sleep in your bank account. So you've got to know the difference between trust, which has to be very high, because every time you're bringing change, you are investing that trust into transformation, and that is experienced as loss. So very often I'm working with leaders and they're like, we read Canoeing the Mountains, I want to be Lewis and Clark, we want to go forward, let's do adaptive change. And I'll come back and we'll do a survey of their congregation, and this is what we'll hear. You know, if he preached a little better, maybe let's try that first. If he knew our names. You know, if she ran a good meeting so that all of our best leaders wouldn't roll their eyes and want to get out of there. Right? There are a certain amount of technical competence you need to have credibility. If you don't handle texts well and traditions well and meetings well and people well, no one is going to follow you into uncharted territory. If you are not trustworthy on the map, no one's going to follow you off the map. And in addition to having technical competence, you also need to be a person of deep relational congruence. So if you haven't listened to the podcast about Mars Hill, consider that more important at this moment than probably reading even my books. I would rather you listen to that. Because what you'll notice is what can happen to a community of people when you have deeply technically competent people who are smart and funny and engaging and have resources and are cool and understand media and have no character, no relational congruence, and how toxic it can become. Trust is needed for transformation, but trust is not transformation. You build trust so you can invest it in transformation. Because the transformation is always an experience of people having to learn and face loss. So what does it require us to kind of think about, the kind of leadership needed to think about these things? Well, as you start developing trust, you then begin to start asking about adaptive capacity. So if we do our thing, if we do our church well, if we're people of competence, if people can trust that we'll handle the scriptures well, we handle the responsibilities well, you handle the money well, you handle all those things well. If you're a good manager, good steward, and you're a person of good character, they know you care about them. You are the same person wherever you show up. I pastored in a small town. There's no way I could fake it. I would see people on the beach trail that I would also see on Sunday morning. There was no way I could fake it. 17 years of being in a small town, everybody knew where I lived. They knew who I was. They knew my dog. They knew my kid. Like I had to be the same person. And at times that was deeply disappointing to people. But once you have trust, technical competence, once you have relational congruence, then you start investing in adaptive capacity. And the first principle is people don't resist change, they resist loss. The first thing you have to understand when you're taking people into uncharted territory is you are taking them into a place where they are going to experience loss. There is no way forward without experiencing loss. For many of us, the very first leadership book we ever read was Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that says learn to think win-win. Win-win is really great for technical solutions. Win-win is great when we got to figure out, okay, who gets to use the room this hour, who gets to use it next hour. Adaptive changes are win-loss. So what's going to be our first priority? Is it going to be taking care of our members or reaching out to new people? Oh, we'll do both. No, you won't. Just tell me, 1A. I'm not saying 0-1. I'm saying, how do you look people in the eye and say, look, here's our challenge. This is what our neighbors need. We want our neighbors to feel a sense of love from us. So here's what we're going to do. And then we say, yeah, but what about our members who've been here forever? What about the people who've invested their lives here? And you have to ask the question, so what are we going to do first? And quite frankly, I think you can be faithful, whatever you decide, but for most of us, we just don't want to be clear enough about the loss. And here's the good news. Y'all can do this. Most of us are really good at helping individuals with loss, right? If right now any of your phones rang and you heard that there was a tragedy in your congregation and that there is some little kid on life support and the parents needed you, you would get out of your seat, you would go there, and they would look at you and say, thank God, Pastor, that you're here. You know what to do. You've been trained for it. You know how to be with people. And if the very worst thing happened, you'd be able to look those parents in the eye and say, I know this is the worst thing that you can imagine, but we are here for you. Our church will be here for you. I will be here for you. And you were trained not to make dumb statements at that moment. You wouldn't say to them, God needed an angel. You would know that how to be empathic and caring. You've been trained for it. What we've never learned to do is apply that same training toward our congregations, toward our communities, toward to this whole group of people. John 12 says, unless a seed falls to the earth and dies, it remains a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Jesus said, right after they came to him and said, the Greeks are interested in you. Hey, buddy, you're scaling. Your likes have gone up. The platform's growing. Oh my gosh, we're expanding into a new market. Let's go. And his answer was, unless you die, you won't bear fruit. He said to tell them the kind of death that he would go through, to which he called them to also. Notice the imagery here. You got a choice. You're a grain. You can either be a single grain, remain alone, until you sit on the pavement, shrivel up and die, or you can choose to go into the dirt, to die and bear much fruit. It's only foolish to think you can avoid this loss one way or another. So which one are you going to lead our people into? This is our calling. This is our moment. This is the moment for the church today. When we have people sitting there saying, we want to go back to the glory days, I got to tell you, I served at Hollywood Presbyterian down the road. In 1963, it was the largest church in the Presbyterian denomination. There were 9,000 members. It was featured in the front section of the LA Times as the wealthiest, biggest church in the entire denomination. In 1963, it was featured there, and I know it was because I got the newspaper. The front section was a report on the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission. Someone saved it. The back page of that same section, Hollywood Presbyterian Church. That's why they gave it to me. That's where I was trained. Todd, you'll be interested in this. It was amazing. In 1963, every one of our denominations were growing. Everything was up and to the right. It was awesome. And the reason why I kept it is that in December 1963, the LA Times used to have a box that would publish for you a week's worth of daily Bible readings. If you can remember the day when the LA Times helped you with your morning quiet time, you'll know what a different day it was in 1963. And I just want to tell you that if 1963 ever comes back, you Baptists are in trouble. We Presbyterians are going to rule. We were awesome in 1963. And 1963 was really awesome for people who look like me. Because you know what also happened in 1963? 250,000 people marched on the Lincoln Memorial for freedom and jobs. Because it wasn't so awesome for everyone. What we have to grapple with is that so much of what we are dealing with is that we have people in our congregation who, if they can't remember 1963, which was even 4 months before I was born, they have the memory of it. And they got the memory of other things. Maybe it's the 1980s, maybe it's the 1990s, maybe it was way back in the old days of 2018. But that past is holding us. It's the canoes. People don't resist change, they resist loss. And we have got to take people through loss. The second part we have to grapple with is for change to last, it must be a healthy adaptation of your core DNA. For change to last, it has to be the healthiest adaptation of who you really are. To become your DNA is like the DNA of your body. It's your identity. It's who you are. And I believe that every organization and every congregation has their own DNA. It has your own set, and your DNA are your core values. And so for change to last, it has to be consistent with your core values. It has to be a healthy adaptation of who you actually are. It's not to become something else that you're not. And for most people, when I talk about core values, this is when they go to me, oh good, we got this one done. Go ahead, skip to lunch. It'll be awesome. We did this. We got our core values. We got a whole group of us together. We did a whole retreat. We looked at the Bible. It was really great. We came up with 5 values. We did a cool thing. They all work with the word grace, because our church is about grace. So the first one is G, it's generous, and R, it's repentant, and A, it's accountable. And that's our values. And this is really what we are. And we tell anybody, if you come here, these need to be your values too, because this is really what we should be doing. And I go, should. You just told me your aspirational values. You tell me what you dream about and what you want to be. And those are really cool. I got aspirational values too. I have aspirations to want to ski with grandkids. Right now it is just an aspiration. My kids are not in any hurry to give me grandkids. But because it's so inspiring to me, I work out. I want to ski with grandkids, and they keep waiting, and that means I got to ski older and older and older. But that's an aspiration, it's a dream, it's a hope. Your healthy adaptive change is your actual values. Let me give you an example of actual values. These are my grandparents. My grandfather's name was Guido Evangelisti. He was an Italian immigrant who came over to avoid World War I. He was going to be conscripted as a teenager. He made his way all the way across to the Netherlands, where he ended up on a boat that went through Ellis Island. In my office, I have a copy of his handwriting from Ellis Island, where he came through Ellis Island, made his way across to the redwoods of California, where he met my grandmother, and they opened an Italian restaurant. When I was a little boy, I was babysat at their Italian restaurant. I'd be out playing in the redwoods, and my grandmother would yell outside, "Todd, time for lunch." I go, "Coming, Grandma. Do you want the ravioli or you want the crab?" "Can I have both?" "Of course." She's my grandmother. And I would come in, and I was the little prince of the forest, and I loved being with my grandmother, and she raised me in her Italian restaurant, and it was amazing. And my grandfather had two big values. We learned them all. Number one was, if you came to America, get an education, because you could do anything with an education. He didn't have an education. He left when he was a teenager. He never got an education, but he so believed in it that this old Italian, who got totally mad at my grandmother because she got a driver's license, because women shouldn't drive, had two daughters get master's degrees, even back then, because a value is education. And the other value was that family stays together around food. We have family meals, and we have our family recipes and our family suppers, and we gather around food. So you show up at my grandmother's house, there'd be platters of raviolis waiting for you. That smell was like love to us. We were home. Because this is what families do. You gather around meals, you have meals together. And in our family, we did the same thing. When our kids were little, we did Sunday suppers every week. Even today, my kids as adults, my son lives in Seattle, my daughter lives in Austin, and before COVID, they hosted family suppers with their friends, because they said this is where love is found and friendship is found. And they passed down the recipes and the things we do. Now, here's what you need to know about my grandfather. He died when he was 60, and I never knew him, which is one of the reasons why I want to ski with my grandkids. But those values are so powerful, I can tell you them today. And they're shaping his great-grandkids. Because your genuine values are the things you genuinely pass down. And the other thing you need to know is, because he died when he was 60, and I want to ski with my grandkids, I can't eat the way that old Italian ate. What he called Tuesday, we call Christmas. You get that meal once a year. And our family dinners have way more grilled salmon than he ever imagined. Because more important to me than even eating the Italian food I love is to adapt those meals so that I can someday ski with grandkids. For change to last, it has to be a healthy adaptation of your core DNA. So how do you find your congregation's core DNA? You do it the way I just did it. You tell stories. You tell stories about heroes, like my grandfather. Or stories about your church in the best moments. You gather people together. I'm working with a church right now that over Thanksgiving, they planned a potluck. The first time they're going to come back as a group. And they're going to have a potluck where they're going to actually sit in tables just like this. And what they're going to do is they said, we haven't been together in so long, we're going to tell family stories. And they're going to basically tell stories. And here's what you tell. Tell stories about a hero. Who's the hero you want everybody to have heard? You wish every new person would have met. Who's the person who... You may not know them, but their values continue on. Like at San Clemente Presbyterian, where I was, there was a woman named Ruth. She was in her 80s when I got there, when I was 33. She used to walk up to me after every service and say, "I prayed for you every day this week, boy. Every day I prayed for you, boy. I prayed for you every day, boy." She got away with calling me boy. Everybody else had to call me Reverend Dr. Boy. And I would say, "Ruth, I'm so glad you prayed for me, because it's getting really hard. We're doing this building program." We were in a building program for 9 years. We were in dust, and we're in debt. We're in distraction all the time. And somebody in town at the clergy prayer gathering said, "We should pray for Todd. He's too busy building Todd's temple up there on the hill." And it really bothered me. "So you can pray for me." And she goes, "Oh, I don't pray for that." What I pray for, boy, is that you don't forget that your job is to preach us the Bible faithfully from Genesis to Revelation in the middle of all that. That you don't ever forget that what you really need to do is keep us faithful to the Word in the middle of all that. Yes, ma'am. You tell stories, and the stories will tell you your values. The stories that are said over and over and over again. Tell the story about the time when you were proud of this church. When you said, "Look, we're not perfect. We got all kinds of problems. But this one day, oh my gosh, we were amazing." When there was a fire at Camp Pendleton, and literally we just told everybody at Camp Pendleton, if you don't have a place to go, come to our church, just come to our fellowship hall, bring the kids, bring the golden retriever, bring whoever you want, we're going to find a place for you. And we just told everybody in the church, you tell us how many people you can take, and we're going to send home some Marines with you. And people would drive up, open the minivan, and go, we'll take 4 and 2 dogs. And they would shuffle them in, and we didn't know where they were going. And we just sent them all off. And 2 days later, they all came back hugging and crying and talking about how they had showers and meals and love. And they went home. And I said, oh my gosh, a bunch of Presbyterians figured out how to do something without an agenda. We just did it. Tell the stories over and over and over again. In our church, we had this picture. This is like this huge gift. We had this picture. When we were tearing down the sanctuary, what we did is, and we were tearing down the whole campus, we blew this picture up to like 4x8, and we put it in the narthex. When you came out of the worship service and you looked out at all that dust and that dirt and that thing that just felt like it was never moving, we would show them this picture. We'd say, this is why we're doing what we're doing. Look at this picture. This picture, it says, the bottom says, First Sunday School held on beach in San Clemente. Here's my favorite part of the story. For years, this picture was in City Hall at San Clemente, and they had a caption over it that said, early marine biology class. Because, it's California, and, you can't have a church picture. And when they were remodeling the church, the City Hall, they found the picture, they pulled off the label, and then they took it apart and realized it was our church. And it was a First Sunday School held on the beach in San Clemente, in our church, and they sent it to us. And we blew it up. And we said, here's why we're doing a building program. What do you notice about this picture? There's no building. That's the first thing. What we want people to get is we're not building this because of buildings. These buildings we're building today, we might have to tear down. That was important because we were tearing down buildings that many people in the church had helped pay for a generation earlier. We wanted people to know buildings are not about buildings. Buildings are about this. What else do you notice in the picture? Multi-generational. Boom. That was our charism. That's what we said we were going to offer. In a day where almost every church in our town was now dividing over generations, when you could go to the cool church down the street that had all the surfers, or you could go to the traditional church up on the hill with all the Methodists who had a big choir, or you could go to the church where everybody was trying to find the group who looked like them and sounded like them, we said our gift is this. You come here, you're going to be put together with people who are your parents and your grandparents. And if you're older, you're going to have kids and little kids and even more annoying kids, because this is who we are. What else do you notice about this? Tell me. Yeah, woman teacher. Okay, so here's an interesting thing. We're Presbyterians. We believed in women in ministry for 40 years. Before this picture came up, we never had a woman pastor. They put this picture up, they've had 4 since then. Why? Because this is who we are. And from the very beginning, and here's the part, is that little girl, 4th from the left, her daughter, so is that's the daughter of this woman. And as an older woman, the granddaughter was in our church. And we knew that this woman knew her Bible and taught, and everybody really loved it and knew it. We had a history of strong women in this church. And the last thing, you probably didn't even notice because you're Baptist and you didn't even notice it, but for us it was huge. That big old thick Bible she's holding, that was Ruth, reminding us that the center of this is the Scriptures. These are our values. And we just happen to have a picture where we could actually say, this is what we've always been about. And what we're going forward to the future for our community is we want to do this for our community. We want to offer this. And what you have to basically be able to do is do the exact same thing. You may not get a picture, but you do have stories. Stories that tell you the values, and it's the healthy adaptation of your core DNA. They're not your aspirational values. It's look for the repetitive, energized themes. Listen to the stories that are told over and over again. Listen to the stories that if you're at a family dinner table, you find yourself saying, Grandma, tell that story one more time. And you also find yourself going, oh my gosh, one more time? This is what I have by now having a son-in-law enter into my family. Somebody who comes from a different family, and all of a sudden he's having to hear all the stories. Tell the story about Guido. Tell the story about what? We realize there are these stories we've told over and over again, and we need our son-in-law to know them so that he knows our values. boil them down to the 3 to 5 values that are most emphasized and most unique to your congregation. This is what makes us unique. And here's your charism. And once you're clear on that, once you're deeply clear on what will never change, get ready to change everything else. People don't resist change, they resist loss. For change to last, it must be a healthy adaptation of core DNA. And the third one is the future is here, it's just on the margins. When Meriwether Lewis stepped over the Lemhi Pass, he was lost. And every single person in the Corps of Discovery, these amazing mountain men, were lost. They were all lost. They were all lost, all except one person. She was a teenage Native American nursing mother. Her name is Sacagawea. In 11th grade history class, you might have learned her name is Sacagawea, but they wrote her name down as Sacagawea. So I'd like to give her back her name and to recognize that at that moment, this woman who they had never done anything as so much as written down a single word she'd said, they now needed because she was at home. This is Shoshone territory, and she was Shoshone. And so she knew exactly where she was. She'd been kidnapped at 11 or 12 and taken over the mountains and held by the Mandan tribe. She was either sold or won in a card game by the French trapper Charbonneau. When Lewis and Clark met her the winter they spent with the Mandan tribe, they were so impressed with her and they needed a translator, so they hired Charbonneau to bring his wife, who gave birth to a baby right before she went. So remember, every time you think about Lewis and Clark and these great, big, brave mountain men who went over mountains and went down rivers and chased down grizzly bears, she did it too, with a baby. And when they stepped over the Lemhi Pass, she was at home. One of the things I want you to think about here is there's all kinds of places in the world today where this world we're in is not new for them. They can't gather. They're not sure who their members are. They don't have resources. They're not sure what to do. And they're growing. There's all kinds of traditions that didn't need the power and privilege of culture. And they're thriving. Do you want to know right today what are the healthy... This is always the moment where people decide if they decide whether they want to hear me this afternoon or not. Here it is. Here's the moment. Disappointing people to wait, you can absorb. Here's the moment. Do you want to know why American religiosity, for all of its foibles, is still stronger than Europe? You want to know the dominant reasons why? Here's the big reason why. Because in American religiosity, the strength of our spirituality is built in 3 communities: African American, Latino, and immigrant. Immigration makes us stronger. Immigration. Christians come to this country. Syrian Christians come to this country. Christians from Latin America come to this country. They come and they bring their church traditions, and the church traditions are stronger. And so we're sitting in congregations that are just pulled apart. And imagine this. I'm not trying to make a political statement here. I'm just saying to say as a pastor, this has got to do something in your head when you start thinking about the fact that most of our churches are more committed to thinking about immigration policy, who could be keeping out brothers and sisters. What are you going to do about that? This is the part that we start to recognize, is that the future is here, and it's just on the margins, and it's in the voices and the people that we haven't listened to before, haven't paid attention to before. And one of the best parts about looking around this room is that you are way more diverse than most rooms I ever get to go into. And to realize this is a strength in an uncharted territory. This is a different world that we're in. People don't resist change, they resist loss. For change to last, it must be a healthy adaptation of core DNA. And the future is here, it's just on the margins. I had to learn this myself when I went back to Fuller. I went back to Fuller Seminary as a vice president, and they had me tour around the campus and meet all the different people in my departments. And I went into one office and they said, "Oh, we know you're here. We know you're busy. We'll have some cookies and stuff. Can you just wait for a moment?" I said, "Sure." I said, "Because we want you to meet one person." I said, "Great." They said, "He's only going to work for you for the next 3 weeks. He's about to graduate. He's a student worker." I said, "Sure, no problem." I said, "Really? We're so glad." I said, "Good." I said, "Who is he?" His name is Pablo Kim. Pablo Kim. His parents were Korean missionaries to Argentina. He grew up speaking Korean in the home, Spanish at school, and enough English to get 2 master's degrees, including one at Fuller. The future of the church does not look like Tod Bolsinger because the church in 1963 and following gave people like me full ride scholarships to seminary. The future of the church looks like Pablo Kim and Juanita Kim. And when we start acknowledging that we now live in a much more global experience where these cultural pieces that are right there in the scriptures are actually coming real in our lifetime, we can start to realize that we have way more capacity than we imagined. All of a sudden I realized the future looks really different than me. Dave Gibbons says the future is already here, it's just on the margins. Dave Gibbons planted a multi-ethnic church in Irvine 25 years ago. It was a church that had no place to meet. So every single week they had to find a different location. And they did it before social media. People used to have to call into a phone or get an email from the church to find out where they were meeting, and they grew the church based on it. They talk about a group of people who were so far ahead of their time. And this experience was happening in Irvine. We begin to recognize at these moments that this capacity for leadership, this capacity to be able to learn as you go, people don't resist change, they resist loss. For change to occur, it has to be a healthy adaptation of your core DNA. It's not becoming something that you're not, but it's becoming the very best version of who you are for the sake of your neighbor. And that there's resources all around us, maybe right in our midst. I'll tell you one last story, and then I'm going to actually talk around your tables before we break for lunch. So they finally made it to the Pacific Ocean. They got through the mountains, and they got through the mountains because Sacagawea took them to the Shoshone. And when they got to the Shoshone, she started translating for the tribal chief, and all of a sudden in the middle of her translation, the tribal chief realized that she was his little sister who had been kidnapped so many years before. And they realized at this moment that these white folk had brought back this little girl, and in complete, utter gratitude, they not only let her continue the journey, but they sent along an experienced older man as a guide. They called him Old Toby. And Sacagawea and Toby took them through the mountains, and they made it. And they end up meeting the Nez Perce, and the Nez Perce meet them at the foot of the next river, and the Nez Perce have a council that night where they decide, you know what, if we kill all of these men, we will be the richest, most powerful tribe in all of the nation. And a young girl came in and said, don't kill them. There were some white folk who treated my family well. Take care of them. And the Nez Perce did. And because they were treated well by the Shoshone and the Nez Perce taught them how to make new boats that were good for this river. They went them all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and when they got to the edge of the Pacific Ocean, they realized there was no way they could get back over those mountains. So they would have to spend the winter in Oregon. Have you ever spent a winter in Oregon? It just rains on you the whole time. It was miserable. They were on the coast of Oregon, and because they had to spend the winter there, they knew what they needed to do was to build a fort. And this is where they'd be. And because they're building a fort, and it's in uncharted territory, and they would plant the American flag, this would now be America in the New World. So they had to decide, where are you going to put the fort? And what they decided to do is to establish America with a really American idea. They took a vote. Lewis and Clark were the representatives of Thomas Jefferson in the United States of America. They were commanders. They could have decided, this is where America will be. Plant the flag. It's right here. They decided, no. In America, people get a voice and they get a vote, and so they gave everybody a vote. You get to vote of where America is going to be, this side of the river or this side of the river. And they all got a vote, and everybody got a vote, including Sacagawea and including York, William Clark's African-American slave. The first time that a Native American, an African American, or a woman had a vote in a United States election or anything close to it was 100 years before the rest of the world would catch up. And don't get me wrong, by the time they went home, they reverted back to their old behaviors. William Clark was a brutal slave master, and he beat York for having the audacity to suggest that because he'd been on this whole journey, maybe he could get sold to another master so he could be with his wife. Well, Meriwether Lewis committed suicide because he was so overcome with depression and he'd been so riddled with anxiety that he took his own life. When they were asked, how do you think Meriwether Lewis was able to lead this amazing expedition? When Thomas Jefferson was asked how he could have done it, he said there was something about the travails of the expedition that kept the demons at bay, the hardships of the expedition. I want to put it this way: we're at our best when we're on mission. We're at our very best when we are not trying to figure out how to go back, but to go forward, when we are learning, facing loss, going forward, listening to voices. We're at our best when we're on mission. And when we yearn to go back, we go back and become more like the culture. We don't change the culture changes us.